Events like these have led to years of development of codes and standards designed to enhance building, fire, and life safety. It's essential that those designing, approving, and maintaining fire alarm and signaling systems have a working knowledge of the relevant codes and standards referenced in their own jurisdiction. For example, a jurisdiction might reference NFPA 72, National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, to determine requirements for these systems. It provides the latest safety provisions to meet society's changing fire detection, signaling, and emergency communications demands. When we refer to a system as compliant, we mean that it meets the requirements of NFPA 72 or a similar code, and all related codes and standards. Because it's primarily relevant to system design and maintenance, we won't be covering NFPA 72 in depth in this lesson. What then is the purpose of a fire alarm and signaling system? These systems have four functions that are central to this learning series. A fire alarm and signaling system detects fire, notifies occupants, controls the function of other systems, and notifies responders. Everything you'll see in this learning series will relate back to these four actions. Every component and system can be tied to them. As you'll see, how these components perform these tasks can vary greatly, but the overall system has been standardized around detecting fire and notifying both occupants and emergency services. The structure of the Fire Alarm System Fundamentals learning series reflects the structure and components of a fire alarm and signaling system, which you can see illustrated here. This system map is something you'll see often in the following lessons. To give you an idea of what you'll learn in those lessons, we'll quickly look at each and see how their content relates to a fire alarm and signaling system. In Controls and Signals, you'll learn about the Fire Alarm Control Unit, or FACU, the heart of a fire alarm and signaling system. A fire alarm control unit receives signals from components throughout the system as inputs and sends signals to others as outputs. The concept of inputs and outputs is central to an understanding of fire alarm and signaling systems. Make sure to always keep it in mind as you proceed. In initiation, we'll look at initiating devices. Initiating devices are all the devices and circuits that send a signal to a fire alarm control unit to provide the status of a protected space or the existence of a fire. Initiating devices include, but are not limited to heat detectors, smoke detectors, water flow switches, and manually actuated devices. We just mentioned how inputs and outputs drive the design and function of a fire alarm and signaling system. What do you think? Do initiating devices provide an input to the fire alarm control unit or receive an output from the fire alarm control unit? Make your selection, then click Submit. That's correct. Initiating devices, such as a heat detector or a smoke detector, send an input signal to a fire alarm control unit. In supervision, you'll learn about how a fire alarm and signaling system monitors other systems, processes, or equipment in a building. Remember, when you see supervision throughout this learning series, it's referring to the system's supervision of those other systems, processes, or equipment. It's not referring to the supervision of the system by an employee. Power supply focuses on the power needs for a fire alarm and signaling system. Systems like these are vital for building, fire, and life safety, so they require constant power. You'll learn about the difference between primary and secondary power supplies, which are the most common way to ensure that a fire alarm and signaling system has a constant source of power. While the primary power supply might be the utility grid, a secondary power supply might be a battery or on-site standby generator. Remember, no single power supply is 100% reliable, no matter how the power is generated and no matter how modern its technology. In notification, you'll learn about the function of notification appliances in a fire alarm and signaling system, which are used to alert occupants to relocate or evacuate in the event of an emergency. You probably have at least some first-hand experience with notification appliances. For example, if you've ever participated in a fire drill. To help you expand your knowledge of notification appliances, we'll illustrate the wide variety of notification requirements throughout different types of facilities with which you might not have any experience. Let's go back to the idea of inputs and outputs. What do you think? Do notification appliances primarily provide an input to the fire alarm control unit, or receive an output from the fire alarm control unit? That's correct. Notification appliances, such as strobes or speakers, receive an output signal from a fire alarm control unit. Fire alarm and signaling systems often can control other building systems to contribute to building, fire, and life safety. You'll learn more about this topic in emergency control functions. You'll learn about the systems that are commonly controlled by a fire alarm and signaling system, and you'll learn about how that control takes place. For example, you'll learn about the way in which a fire alarm and signaling system is connected to a building's elevators, controlling elevator power shutdown, elevator recall, or both in the event of a fire. Earlier, we defined a fire alarm and signaling system as being able to detect fire, notify occupants, control the function of other systems, and notify emergency services. Off-premises signaling and supervising stations covers the components necessary for notifying emergency services and related functions. This is the final lesson of the Fire Alarm and Signaling System Fundamentals learning series. By the end of this learning series, after you've completed each of the lessons that we've just outlined, you should be able to look at this illustration of a fire alarm and signaling system, understand its structure, and describe the function of its common components. As you proceed, think about the fire alarm and signaling systems around you. Think about which components they include, where those components are located, how the system operates, and how it keeps building occupants safe. Now let's return to roles and responsibilities. Earlier, we discussed the range of roles that benefit from the foundation of knowledge covered by this learning series. A fire alarm and signaling system fails if those involved with it don't have that complete foundation. Next, to examine relevant roles and responsibilities, we'll cover the life cycle of a fire alarm and signaling system, from design to installation to usage to maintenance and change management. And we'll list and describe the roles that are most commonly responsible for each stage of the life cycle of a fire alarm and signaling system. For this lesson, we're going to define the life cycle of a fire alarm and signaling system as the continuous application of 4 processes. These processes are design, installation, maintenance, and change management. You might have the opportunity to be part of the design and installation of a new fire alarm and signaling system for a new construction. But you might also work with a system that's been in a building for decades and gone through this life cycle many times. Imagine an office building. The owners have been renting out office space for years and want to expand to a second building on nearby property. The needs of the new building are identified, and a design is drafted. Construction begins. The components of the fire alarm and signaling system are purchased and installed, inspected, and approved. With the building systems all functional, tenants begin moving in. Time goes by, and the system is inspected, tested, and maintained as needed. So far, we've seen the first 3 stages of the life cycle. But what about change management? The owners decide to build a new addition that will bridge the 2 buildings. Among the many things they'll need to consider is how this will impact the fire alarm and signaling systems. Currently, each building has a separate system, but how will that change after the addition is built? Managing change effectively is essential to the long-term success of a fire alarm and signaling system. Whatever the owners choose, they'll need to repeat the other stages of the life cycle, identifying needs and creating a new design, installing and configuring new equipment, which will then need to be inspected and maintained. Remember, as long as these structures are occupied and maintained, the life cycle will continue. Now that we've illustrated the life cycle, let's go back into it to examine the different roles involved and their responsibilities. First, the system's owner. It's their responsibility to define and articulate the needs of the system, and they must be present, aware, and active throughout every stage of the life cycle, from design to ongoing maintenance. The system's designer must evaluate building conditions, determine code requirements for the system, and ensure a clear understanding of the owner's fire protection goals for the system's performance. The authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ, is also essential to the process. This is the organization, office, or individual responsible for enforcing the requirements of a code or standard. In addition to the owner, designer, and AHJ, there are some other roles that are essential during the system's installation, including the equipment supplier, the system programmer, and the installer. Though they each provide a specific function, they're all responsible for understanding the system design, and they must all have appropriate qualifications for their role. Think of your experience with fire alarm and signaling systems. What's your role in the process? Where do your responsibilities fit in the life cycle of the system? Could you identify specific people who fill other roles that are specifically relevant to yours? Remember, everyone plays a part in the long-term effectiveness of the system, no matter their role, or what parts of the system's life cycle require their attention and skill. You've reached the end of this lesson. You should now be able to describe the importance of a compliant fire alarm and signaling system for building, fire, and life safety. Describe the basic design of fire alarm and signaling systems. List relevant roles and responsibilities in fire alarm and signaling system design, installation, usage, and maintenance. And navigate the lessons in this Fire Alarm System Fundamentals learning series. Thank you for your participation. You may now proceed to the assessment for this lesson. Now it's time to find out what you've learned. You'll be presented with a series of questions. A score of 70% or higher is required to pass. You'll have as many attempts as needed to obtain a passing grade. Note that there is no audio with the assessment questions. Select the next button when you're ready to begin. You have successfully finished the assessment. Once you complete the course evaluation, you will be awarded your certificate of completion with CEUs. You may now exit the module.